You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. This week, my guest is Dan Wells. Thank you for joining us on the show today, Dan.
Hey, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. So, Dan, I came to know you and your writing through another podcast that you do, Writing Excuses, which for about 2 years now has been my Monday morning commute listen, and from there, getting to know all four of you guys, I got into the John Cleaver series, which I'm a total fan of. But why don't you give us a little history about how you got into writing?
Into the writing or into the podcast?
Into writing. We'll get to the podcast in a little bit.
I mean that story starts a very long time ago. I actually told my parents in second grade that I was going to be an author. And I think they just smiled and nodded and said, okay, but what are you going to do until that works out? And so, you know, it was nice to have that kind of artistic support even that young. My parents never said, no, that's a stupid idea, which is, I suspect, what a lot of parents might say. But
right.
Even then, you know, I never really took that seriously as a career goal until college, because it never occurred to me that I could actually make money doing it. And I don't know why, you know, because you go into a bookstore and there are literally thousands of books in it.
Right.
And so it's obviously an industry in which people do make money. But, you know, I think our educational system is not geared towards artists. It wants to take a child and raise it up and put it in a cubicle and have it earning a salary and a retirement fund.
Yeah.
And anything you do outside of that is much harder because you have to do all the hard work yourself. But anyway, so I grew up writing poetry and short stories, and I did a comic book for a couple of years in high school, and all of this stuff just on my own for fun. And then in college, took a creative writing class. I was studying English with an emphasis in editing, so I, you know, was always all about words, but I figured that if I wanted to make money with words, it would have to be through the editing side. And took a creative writing class as just for fun, and the teacher came in. It was Dave Farland, and he said, the first thing he said was, you could make a living as an artist. And so I said, okay, well, if that's possible, no one had ever told me that before. Now that I knew it was possible, that's my goal. And so I started a writing group with Brandon Sanderson and a couple other people. This was way back before either of us were published. And, you know, set to work writing. I started writing fantasy novels. I'd been reading fantasy my whole life, and Brandon was writing fantasy, and so I wrote 5 fantasy novels that were awful. No one will ever read them. But you know, eventually, you know, the books just got darker and darker as I kind of zeroed in on what was most interesting to me. And eventually the writing group said, you know, Dan, just quit flirting with it and actually write a horror novel. And I said, well, okay, let's give this a shot. And wrote I Am Not a Serial Killer, the first John Cleaver book. And as creepy as it sounds to say it, it felt like coming home. Like it was so comfortable to be in that genre, in that voice, and in that tone. And I just really responded to it and loved it. I wrote that book in 6 weeks, which is the fastest I've ever written a book. before or since. But
how many words
liked it.
is I Am Not a Serial Killer?
How many what? Sorry.
How many words?
It's actually very short.
Yeah.
It's between 65 and 70,000, probably on the shorter end of that scale.
Okay.
Which for an adult book is short. I mean,
Yeah.
thriller is probably the shortest word count of the adult books anyway,
Yeah.
and it's still even short for a thriller. Um,
So you were on a NaNoWriMo pace with that book.
yeah, I was.
50,000 in a month at 65, 70 in about 6 weeks.
Hmm.
That's some serious writing.
It went very quick, and well, okay, but I spent about a year before that
Hmm.
figuring out, the exact expression of that idea that I wanted to follow up on. The genesis of that idea came from a conversation with Brandon where I was talking about the McDonald triad, which is a set of serial killer predictors, um, and was talking about various ways of predicting serial killer behavior and how there are traits common to most serial killers, and hit on this idea of a character who has all of the predictors but is trying hard not to follow that fate, to not live up to his own potential. And that's a great idea,
Absolutely.
but there's so many different ways to do it. And so, like I said, I spent about a year. For a long time, I had designed it almost as an Addams Family kind of story, where everyone in his family was some kind of horror or thriller archetype. And his father was this kind of horrible monster, and his sister was a witch, and it was almost played for laughs. And there was a version where he was already an adult. The first full draft of the book, that one I wrote in 6 weeks, he was 12 rather than 15 years old. And so it just went through a lot of different iterations before I found the one that I think worked the best.
Well, and your protagonist, John Cleaver, being 15 years old, brings a whole different level to the genre. What gave you the idea to make him a young character?
Well, it goes back to that idea of serial killer predictors, because the way serial killer psychology develops, and I have had some very interesting, not only reading about the psychology, but talking to psychologists. You know, Living in Salt Lake City, it was easy to find people with kind of hands-on history with serial killers, so to speak. This is where Ted Bundy was very first captured and interviewed, and so talking to the doctor who, um, the way serial killers develop is you have, first of all, you have to have this sense of sociopathy, this lack of emotional connection to other people. Um, a lot of it is fantasies about death or about control. There's all of these different elements, but the key to it all comes when, and I skirted this issue a lot in the books, but the key to it comes in adolescence, when you hit puberty and become interested in sex and connect ideas of violence or control directly to feelings of sex or love. And, even for serial killers that don't have a strong sexual component in their crimes, there is still that psychological connection between violence and love. And so there comes this branch point where that happens in your life, and you either follow it into darkness or you turn away from it. And that branching point happens during adolescence. And so really to tell the story about the choice of whether or not to become a serial killer, you are telling an adolescent story almost inevitably. And so I didn't write it as a YA novel, and various publishers do or don't consider it YA. But it was written around that psychological moment rather than around any particular character or genre.
What year did you publish I Am Not a Serial Killer?
If I remember correctly, I think it was 2009. It might be 2008.
And was that your first large length work? First novel length
first
work?
novel publication. I had a short story in a small press science fiction magazine several years before that, like in 2001 or 2. And then nothing until Serial Killer came out. And I think, I'm trying to remember because it was when my 6-year-old was born. So that would have been 2008.
Okay.
Is when I quit my job, but I quit a little bit before the books came out. So that's why I'm thinking 2009.
Okay. So what sort of work did you do before you were published?
I worked for a bunch of health and beauty companies, really.
Naturally.
Living in Utah, one of the big, huge industries in Utah is multi-level marketing. I don't know what that says about us as a culture, but they're everywhere here. And so I, with the exception of 1 year where I worked for a fitness company, writing yoga, what's the word, programs, and describing ellipticals and treadmills and things like that. Aside from that 1 year, it was all network marketing companies, and most of them were about health and beauty, so shampoo and lotion and vitamins and all these different things. There were 2 years in there where I worked for a network marketing scrapbooking company called Close to My Heart, which sold stamps and paper and fancy little thingies, and that was the job I had when I got the idea to buckle down and write a horror novel. And I look back on it and really think it might have been in direct response to how non-horrific that job was, like how cutesy it was. It was like working in a sewing circle. I was one of 7 men in the building. Everything there was, just carefully designed to be as cute as possible. And after 2 years in that environment, I had my cubicle walls just papered with pictures of zombies. And I would spend my lunch breaks reading crimelibrary.com and all these other things, just to inject some very welcome darkness into that environment.
Wow.
But yeah, for about 8 years there, I was just working on a series of marketing departments, is I guess what you would say. I wrote website copy, I wrote catalog copy, I wrote training manuals, all for health and beauty products, and then this scrapbooking company.
Well, at least you can say that you were writing during that time, and that you were working, as a writer. A lot of us have to, do the most mundane jobs while we pursue our writing on the side. So that's, I guess you could chalk that up at least.
Yeah, it was nice, but at the same time it was difficult.
I'll bet.
You spend all day sitting in front of a screen writing.
Right.
Then you go home and your brain's just burned out.
And you're writing someone else's words.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so even though it's there's still that excitement, and that's really the only way you can do it, is you have to come home and be excited and say, finally, I get to do my own stuff.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, you're just too burned out on writing altogether. But I feel like I was blessed with insomnia, because I was able to, work all day at a computer and then come home, put the kids to bed, and then write from 10 p.m. until 2 a.m. almost every day for years. And that's when I got all of these books written. Now that I'm full-time, I'm able to write during the day and watch Netflix all night, so much more enjoyable.
Oh, man. So, when did you guys start the podcast, Writing Excuses?
It was right before I was published. We actually started I'm not entirely certain of the timeline, but it was, not only was I unpublished, but I hadn't sold a book yet. Brandon wanted to start this thing because his brother, Jordan, who's our producer, he suggested the idea, and Brandon said, oh, okay, we could do like a how to write podcast. There are several of those out there. There's a podcast for everything under the sun, probably 10 podcasts for everything under the sun.
Yeah.
But there was not at the time one that was as fast-paced as ours, as Writing Excuses. And so Brandon said, well, that's a niche we can fill, so let's take a look at that. And he grabbed Howard because at the time, this was so long ago, Brandon had not hit, he didn't have the Wheel of Time deal. His books were successful without being huge. And so Howard Taylor had by far the biggest audience of any of our local friends. And so he said, well, let's grab him because he has this huge audience, so people actually listen to the show. Plus, he's very smart and he knows about writing, and he writes a different style than Brandon. And then he invited me, literally just because we'd known each other for years and he knew I was funny. So I was brought on as the still unpublished funny guy who could crack jokes while Brandon and Howard talked about writing. And then a few months later, I don't remember how many episodes into the run, I sold my first book. And actually, there was a very brief time when I had a bigger contract than Brandon ever had. My biggest market at the time, and possibly still, I'm not certain of the numbers, is Germany. Selling the books to a German publisher was the reason I was able to quit and go full time. And that first sale from a German publisher was a bigger single contract than any of us had ever had before, including Brandon. So for about a week, I was able to rub it in his face and say, ha ha, I sold more than you, ha 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 ha. And then, after a week, he got the Wheel of Time deal and skyrocketed into the upper stratosphere of fandom. So I look back with fondness on that 1 week.
Yeah, and you'll always have that week. That's
I'll
something.
always have that week.
That's right. So you guys have a community of writers there in that region, the Salt Lake region, that seem to be hugely popular and successful. What is it about that region where you are that breeds science fiction, fantasy, horror writers, do you think?
I don't know what it would be. And it definitely is. Utah has got more genre fiction writers than any other state except, I think, New York and California, which outweigh us by 20 times the population at least.
Right.
And I don't know what it is, but it is a big enough community and a weird enough anomaly that even the publishing houses in New York have all noticed it, because I am not, I'm fairly mid-list as authors go, but we have Brandon, who's one of the biggest fantasy authors out there. We have James Dashner, Ali Condi, who are next to Suzanne Collins, probably the best-selling science fiction writers in the country. Shannon Hale, James Dashner, and that's only mentioning the mega bestsellers. There's tons, there's dozens, if not hundreds of others. A lot of them are writing young adult. That's huge here. Most of them are in science fiction or fantasy. A very tiny handful of them are in horror. There's 4 of us that I can think of off the top of my head that are nationally published horror authors. And I don't know why. It is a big enough phenomenon that people are aware of it and ask about it all the time.
Yeah.
And I can't really point to a clear answer and say it's because of this. Salt Lake City is hugely Mormon.
Right.
Is it a Mormon influence? I don't think so, because a ton of the authors here are not Mormon.
Interesting.
Is it because of, it might be simply because we tend to be very tight-knit as a community, just culturally here in Utah.
Yeah.
We are kind of natural networkers. And so years ago, looking back at, whether it was Orson Scott Card or Dave Wolverton or Tracy Hickman or whoever was the first one to get this ball rolling decades ago, has just attracted a community, and that community is built up. And we can point to all of these different writing conventions that we have here. There's just a lot of support for writers. And it's kind of a chicken and the egg thing. Is that because the writers are already here or not? I don't know. But it is a really great community in which to be a writer, because there's so many of us and because we are all so supportive. So it was great to be able to kind of grow up in that environment, I guess, starting 6 or 7 years ago.
BYU has a really great creative writing department, don't they? That's very supportive of the genre.
Well, BYU as an administration, as a school, is actually not very supportive of science fiction at all.
Well, being from the outside, you would never know that.
Yeah, and that's because despite their best efforts, the community is still there, regardless of how actively they try to kill it. They had a science fiction convention that had its home at BYU for decades, and then a couple years ago they finally were able to drive it away. Brandon and I and many other of the locals worked on BYU's science fiction magazine, which is called The Leading Edge, and the university is now kind of actively trying to kill that as well. And I don't know why. I hesitate to speculate, but they, like I said, the shining upside to that is that, no matter how many times they shoot that community in the head, it never dies, because it is so strong, and the writers there are so active and so supportive of each other that you cut off one head and 2 more grow in its place. So
that's interesting. That's great insight into something that the rest of us know nothing about. But back to John Cleaver. I am not a typical horror fan. It's just not my cup of tea. And I also grew up in a very conservative environment, and where horror is not something that is generally appreciated, shall we say. But the way you handled the situation and the character, and really peeling back his character and his motivations and things like that were just really endeared me to to the whole line. What do you think it is about horror that captivates our collective imagination?
Well, we can retreat to the great H.P. Lovecraft quote, where he said that fear is mankind's oldest and strongest emotion. And if we look at art as the quest to create an emotional response in the audience, then fear is really one of the easiest emotional responses to create. Humor is very subjective. Not everyone finds the same stuff funny. Romance is similarly subjective in that, you can't attract everyone with the same story or the same characters. We're all going to fall in love with different things. And yet, most people tend to be afraid of the same things. We're afraid of isolation. We're afraid of abandonment. We're afraid of death. We're afraid of all these things that are very primal. The eyes in the dark in the jungle that our brains have evolved in order to identify and run away from. That's just a part of what it is to be human. And so that's the simplistic answer, I think, to why horror is so affecting. But I don't know if I have to assume that there's a bigger answer to that question, and I don't know what it would be. Horror is, I don't know. I feel like I'm talking in circles. I wish I had a better answer to this question because I get it a lot. But every culture has ghost stories. Sure. Every culture has urban legends. We will sit around and talk about things that frighten us. And now that I've talked about how it's somehow intrinsically different from humor, maybe it's not. There are a handful of genres in the world that are specifically designed to provoke a physical response, not just emotional, but physical. We tell a story and it makes you laugh or it makes you shiver. And that's just something that we enjoy as a species. I guess the third genre there would be pornography, but which I suppose we also enjoy as a species. But there's that distinct physical response. Your body changes. The balance of chemicals in your blood changes as you read a horror story and get either thrilled or disgusted or terrified, and your heart starts to beat faster. I remember reading. I like you. I don't consider myself a typical horror reader. I never really read that genre, but I remember reading a story called The Sand Kings by George R. R. Martin, which was this novella about a guy who gets this kind of alien ant farm thing that he watches these creatures as they develop, and they live in a glass terrarium in his living room. And at one point, the glass breaks, and some of these things spill out of it. And right as I read that part of the story, something brushed my leg, and I jumped out of the chair. Just like I've never had that experience before, where I literally leapt like 4 feet in the air.
Oh my God.
And it came at exactly the right point. And I look at that and I think, I wish that I had some way of recreating that for other people. Like when you go into the 3D theaters at Disneyland and they've got little jets of air or little wires under the chairs that'll hit you in the ankles. in order to get that response. But when you're reading a really good horror story, you don't need those extra physical stimuli because the human brain just creates them all by itself. And that's fun. I mean, it's the same thrill that we get from a roller coaster, where we strap ourselves in and get to experience a semblance of danger without any actual danger.
Please tell me you've had the opportunity to share that story with George R.R. Martin.
I have not. I did get to, my one conversation with him was at a Hugo Losers party, which is a tradition that he started, and he
Nice.
Hands out all these ribbons that say Hugo Loser, and it has a picture of a crashed and broken rocket on it. And so, the first time I was nominated for a Hugo and went to the party, I think this was in Reno, went to the Hugo party afterwards, and someone had to talk me into it. It might have been Cory Doctorow who said, "No, he's right over there. You just have to ask him, and he'll give you a ribbon." And I was kind of too starstruck to do anything other than, "Hi, I was told you had a ribbon."
Oh, that's great.
No, but someone did share a similar story with me. Someone was reading, I don't remember if it was Serial Killer or if it was Mr. Monster, which is the second book in the series, but a friend of mine who lived at the time in this very small town in central Utah, and she was all alone. Her husband and her kids were on vacation. They were like camping or something, and she had stayed at home and was reading my book at night alone in her house and was already getting terrified. And she got right to the part where one of the monsters show up and her power went out.
Oh, gosh.
And I think, how can I package an EMP in the back of every hardback copy so that right when you turn a certain page, it will kill the power in your house? Like, that would be such a great thing to be able to reproduce.
Well, that's why I only read your books outdoors in the daylight. It's just part of my personal mission statement.
Probably wise.
Yeah, it's probably wise. So is John Cleaver, is his story still going on? Are you still writing with that character?
Yeah, I had left that character for several years. Wrote those first 3 books all inside of about a year's time. And then, they were published once a year. And figured I was done. I have always considered him to be a series character, someone who could extend on into many, many books, like a Jack Ryan or whoever. But I wrote those books, and his character arc was so strong for me. I liked where he ended up, and there was always room to continue it. I don't want to provide any specific spoilers for people who haven't read the 3rd book, but the 3rd book ends very conclusively, but with strong hints of a new direction the series could take. And it wasn't for several years before I was finally struck with an idea that I considered strong enough to be worth following up. I set a rule for myself when I started writing that I was only going to write what I was excited about. I didn't ever want to be in a position where I was slogging through a book that was going to pay me a bunch of money, but that didn't really blow my hair back, And because if I'm not excited about it, I can't expect the readers to be excited about it. And so cranking out another John Cleaver book was never the goal for me, even though my German publisher, every time I talked to him for 4 years, would say, "Okay, so when's the next one coming? When's the next one coming?" And finally, last year, while I was writing something else, hit onto this idea of what would be the new direction for John? How can I be true to who his character is, and also be true to who his character became over the course of 3 books, which is very, very different from where he started at the beginning of the first one. How could I tell a new story about him that would continue from that point, but also be familiar enough that readers would love it, and also have at its core some conflict that really got me excited, and all of those things came together last year, and I wrote an email to my German publisher and said, hey, if I were to write another John Cleaver book, would you be interested in it? And his response was to send me the cover mock-up that he had already created, and complete with the title and everything. And I'm like, actually, I was going to title it something else. He said, no, I'm going to change it to this one. So, and then, took it right back to Tor and said, do you guys want this? And they said, sure. So this summer, actually on the 4th of July, I released a John Cleaver novella called Next of Kin that is kind of an intro, kind of it bridges the gap between the 2 trilogies. And then starting next year, the first book of a new John Cleaver trilogy comes out in June, and it's called The Devil's Only Friend.
With a cover that is very Poe esque in my mind when I saw it on your website.
It's a great cover.
It is a great cover.
I love this new direction. It's the same designer, the same artist in-house at Tor, Peter Lutjen, who, I'm probably butchering his name. He did the first 3 with this kind of very distinct cover style in which he took actual paper, like he would print the title out in a specific type treatment onto paper, and then he would deface it. For the first book, he actually took an X-Acto knife to a notebook and just dug a big trench in it, and then took a photo of it, and that's the cover. And for the second one, he sliced it into ribbons, and for the third one, he actually burned the paper. And it was this really clever series design, kind of a theme that ran through it. And for this new one, he's gone in a very different direction, but I love it. It's just a classic thriller cover. With once people have read the book, I think they'll look back at the cover and look at 2 or 3 different elements and go, oh, those mean way more than I thought they did. So that's going to be fun.
So between the first Cleaver trilogy and this new one, you shifted gears in a totally different direction, didn't you, with the partial sequence?
Yeah, and the partial sequence really kind of came out of nowhere. This was after the first few serial killer books had been written, and I was working on something else. And an editor at HarperCollins, they were essentially just looking for more YA dystopia, because that was the huge thing. I mean, it still is kind of a huge thing in Hollywood. It finally caught on in Hollywood like last year, but
yeah. Well,
anyway,
and I have 4 teenagers at home, and one that's 10 years old, and YA dystopia is still huge.
Oh yeah, that's probably most of what they read.
Yeah.
So Harper, this editor, went to my agent and said, "We're looking for more of this. Do you have any?" And she said, "Well, not as such, but I have an author who could totally kill it if you want to talk to him." And so within an hour, I was on the phone with this guy. It was Jordan Brown and Ruta Remus were the 2 editors who were spearheading this project, and they came to me and said, "Do you have anything like this? Any trunk novels, anything else?" And I said, "Well, no, but there are, going back to that kind of mission statement of things that excite me. Here are the ideas about dystopia that excite me. Let's talk about them." And had
a couple of phone conversations in which we basically just shot ideas at each other back and forth. What if we did this? What if we did this? And it was really very collaborative with the editors, which was a very different experience from just writing serial killer novels in my basement. But once we kind of settled on an idea that I was very excited about, that they were very excited about, we said, let's do this, and wrote up a contract, and I wrote the Partials series. And it was night and day different, in terms of working with a different publisher, selling to a different audience. A lot of people consider the John Cleaver books to be YA, but you know nothing of YA if all you've read is John Cleaver, because it's just a completely different market out there once you get into the, I was able to do a couple of group book tours with other writers like Veronica Roth and Lauren and Claudia Gray and Kirsten White and all of these kind of fantastic dystopian and paranormal writers. And, for the first few of those, the first year when I just had Partials, the first book, it was very funny to me to be on these group tours, because we'd go like to Los Angeles and there'd be, 30 people there for one of the authors and 30 people there for one of the other authors, and maybe 400 people there for Veronica Roth because she was so huge. And my 30 people would be maybe, if I was lucky, 10 teenagers and then like 20 old guys who would stand in the back of the Barnes and Noble and kind of feel out of place at this teen girl extravaganza. And they'd listen to all the talks, and then they'd stand in the line and come up, and we could always look at the crowd and say, oh, well, those are the Dan fans. these big dudes with beards, they're not here for Claudia Gray. But I really like science fiction. I grew up reading it, and so I've kind of settled into now this really nice arrangement where I'm able to publish thrillers and horror, these kind of more adult titles with Tor, and then teen science fiction with Harper. And now that the Partials series finished, the third one came out this year. Starting next year, or actually it might be, it's winter, the winter season, which goes from December through March, and so it might actually bleed into 2016. But at some point within that period, I have a new young adult science fiction series coming out from Harper called Mirador. The first one is called Blue Screen, and that is a teen cyberpunk group of girls in 2050 Los Angeles who are professional video gamers and get involved with various underworld elements in this near future setting. So it's kind of cyberpunk thriller romance, whatever. I don't know how you want to describe it, but it's super fun. I love these books.
That reminds me of Soda Pop Soldier by Nick Cole, who's also published by Harper. I don't know if you've read that, but
I haven't.
It's an excellent book. You would probably love it. In that same futuristic pro gamer falling into the underworld type scenario. It's an excellent book. Yeah. That brings up a great question. So you're juggling these two aspects of writing, not aspects, these two genres that you're writing in, with the teen audience and more sci-fi and the more adult themes of your horror books. Do you write those two things at the same time, or do you have to completely finish one project and shift gears to get back into that other character space?
I prefer, just in general, to do one project at a time and finish it. And that's regardless of which genres I'm trying to cross. I can't always do that. And what I have found is, when called upon, when forced to do so, I can write, for example, do the outlining of one book concurrent with the writing of another book, because then that's two different parts of my brain. I can combine the outlining headspace and the writing headspace without causing too many problems. But if I'm trying to actually write prose in two different series at the same time, it will completely mess me up. But
how detailed is your outline?
Oh, my outlines get crazy.
Really?
I for a long time, and I didn't do this on the last book, but for a long time I would actually outline in a spreadsheet, because I wanted to be able to track, like with the partial series in particular, especially books 2 and 3, which had so many characters and so many viewpoints, making sure that I knew, what is the core plot thread that's going to pull us through this book, and how are we going to fit all these other viewpoints in, and how are we going to introduce all of the side plots and the side characters, and how are we going to make all of them satisfying for the third book? How are we going to pull all of these plot threads together into a massive climax at the end that ties up all 3 books? Tracking where each character was and what they were doing in a spreadsheet was the only way I could keep all of that clear in my head. Every writer is different. I have to know the ending before I start writing. And so I will outline, I'll figure out exactly what my ending is going to be and what are the main steps that I need to get there, and refine that into an outline that is often chapter by chapter or even scene by scene of the entire book. And once I have that in place, then I feel confident to sit down and start writing, and in many cases ignore the outline altogether. And it sounds weird to spend so much time building it only to ignore it. But once I've built it, think of it as a road trip. Once I know where I'm going to go, I'm driving from here to Chicago, and I need to know how to get to Chicago and plan that route and figure out, where I'm going to spend the night on each night. But once I'm actually on the road, I have the freedom to say, well, let's take a detour here and go see the world's largest ball of twine, and let's take another detour here because there's a cool scenic overlook that I don't want to miss, and maybe I'll spend an extra night in this hotel and skip the next one. Once you know the plan, it's very easy to change it on the fly. And so I feel like I'm a cross between an outline writer and a seat-of-your-pants discovery writer.
I'm the same way in that I need to know the ending before I begin. But occasionally I will know that I'm going to end up in Chicago, but by the time I get there, I'm kind of in a suburb of Chicago. Do you find yourself, when you get there, the ending is slightly different because of things that you've discovered as you went?
Yes. The best example I can think of is actually from the new John Cleaver book. So I can't give you any specifics, but even looking back at the other John Cleaver books, I'm hesitant to. Okay, well, I'll tell you for the very first one. I figure I can be more spoilery with a 6-year-old book than I can with some of the others.
There you go.
So apologies to people who haven't read. I won't say everything. But the first book ends with, John has encountered this supernatural monster, and he has spent most of the book trying to hunt it and figure out how to kill it. And it ends with him killing that monster. And in the first draft, he did that out by the lake. Like, he was able to basically set a trap for this monster and isolate it and kill it when it was out out where it wouldn't hurt anyone. And while that may have been an intelligent plan, it was not an exciting one. And, I wasn't happy with it. My writing group wasn't really responding to it. And, it was where I intended to end up, but it wasn't right. And so we looked at that and thought, well, I think what the problem is that there is not enough tension. His plan works too effectively, and there's not enough sense of danger to it. And so what I did was I brought his mom into it. And, his mom seeing the monster at the end of the first book is so integral to the series that I can't imagine I ever didn't plan it that way. But that was really a, third draft, fourth draft kind of addition where I realized the ending I had planned was wrong, and I need to put his mom in danger and expose, everything he's been trying to do to his mother. And then that character relationship suddenly meant so much more. And by the third book has progressed to such an incredible point. And it was all just because that first ending didn't work.
And it's great to give yourself the freedom to say, I'm just going to understand that this process is all about me learning as I go, as well as the character. It's great to give yourself the freedom to do that.
Yeah, there are some authors who outline everything just so strictly and so intensely, and like I say, every author's different, and if that's what works for you, then that's awesome. But from my perspective, I feel bad for those people, because I'm like, you're missing out on this wonderful experience of discovering the characters as you write them. And so that's one of the reasons when people ask for writing advice, I have 2 or 3 things that are just my standard answer to that question, and one of them is try new styles. Whatever kind of author you think you are, you might be wrong. You never know if you're an outliner until you've tried an outline. You never know if discovery writing is going to float your boat until you try it. And so even if you think that you are into one thing, try the others just as an experiment. And that goes for genre as well. If you think you're a fantasy writer like I was, go ahead and branch out. Write a science fiction, or write a horror, or a thriller, or a historical, or whatever. Pick something else and give it a shot. And it's hard, but you might find that you absolutely love it, and you never would have known if you hadn't tried it.
That's great advice. Dan Wells, thank you for taking time out of your early Saturday morning to sit and just chat about writing. I really appreciate it. How can people find more of your writing, and do you blog, and where can people connect with you?
Okay, well, my main website is thedanwells.com. It's the humblest name I could think of.
Absolutely.
I do have a blog that updates very sporadically, and that's linked on that main website, or you can just look it up directly at fullsymmetry.net. In general, though, The Dan Wells is my internet persona. You can find me on Twitter, you can find me on Facebook, you can find me wherever you want to find me. I'm actually, this week I've gotten onto Pinterest as well, but all the boards there are still secret. I'm using that as kind of another outlining tool that I'm experimenting with. So anyway,
interesting.
I would be delighted for people to say hi on Twitter or drop by the website or whatever.
Well, and if this new way of outlining with Pinterest, if that works for you, I hope you'll share some of those secrets with the rest of the world sometime.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. Well, great. Dan, thank you. It's been a blast, and I can't wait for the new John Cleaver book to come out.
Well, thank you for having me. This was fun.
Thanks.